Any volunteers or note takers? Brian, Mike. Brian, Mike was volunteers. You said your name. We should all nominate one.
Justin does a good job. Something wrong.
Yeah, you took notes. It was great. I will take notes on each of that. I encourage and beg everyone to
Thank you.
because I'm going to
Yeah, we can start. It's Friday. We're not going to get any more people.
No, that's not. We did it before.
And then this. Yeah, the more icons, the merrier. Well, whatever. Right.
There we go.
Yeah. I don't know.
There we go. Okay.
What they did it?
I just used these arrows instead of the up
Ah,
and
okay.
down.
Yeah. All right. I think we can start.
Okay.
All right.
John, did you get the jabber? No?
I'm trying. What's my registration ID?
No.
I don't have a registration ID. There. No, that's the registration ID. Get out.
We have two people on Meet Echo, but no Marius.
Okay. Somebody else able to join the jabber? John's jabber challenge so far.
We have another round of 2 seats at the end. Oh, Phil's not here this week?
No, he's not here. Is he on the?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Let's see when that. How you doing, John?
They were both participation.
Okay, everybody, we'll get started. I'll go close the door.
No.
Yeah, okay. Note well, of course. Button, here we go. Oh, that one. So our agenda, anybody have any suggestions, changes to the agenda? Okay. No comments on the agenda. So a little update. First item is an update on security event tokens. Congrats, we got an RFC out. I think I kind of like got my notes here a little redundant. So it's already being referenced in 2 places. One of those is OpenID Connect back channel logout, where it's a message being sent back channel. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Mike. You're much more familiar with that.
The back channel, Mike Jones, Microsoft, the back channel spec originally had a custom JOT token for the logout token, and as SET developed, it became clear that it was a reasonable fit, so we modified the custom logout token format to be a SET.
Great, thank you, Mike. And then the other place it's referenced is in RISC, which is another OpenID Foundation standard. RISC is standard for providers to share signals about mutual customers, for them to talk about what's happening in account transitions on each of their sites, to help the sites together by sharing information, better protect their common customers. And the SET is the effectively the core message that's going back and forth between providers. There's links for both of those. Any comments, questions on that? If not, we'll go to our next topic. Okay, let's see how my presentation foo works here. Escape's not working. Really?
Get it out of full screen with this, I think.
Oh, there we go. Okay. And which one? What is that?
Push.
Push. There's a clicker. Whether the
Does it
clicker
get to
works,
work?
whether the clicker works is an open question.
Present.
Yeah. There, you give it a try.
And all that kind of stuff. And I feel about the new push-based set token delivery HTTP. And to put basically in the air quotes here because the clicker does not work.
Okay. My finger does. So,
Excellent.
okay.
So just watch my thumb. Okay, so if you recall from London, we had a big discussion around what do we want to do with this HTTP push draft that we had. The second event delivery spec that we had that contained both mechanisms for push-based delivery and poll-based delivery over HTTP. The consensus we arrived at. Oh, hey.
Is that better? Whoa, that's much better. Okay, wow, okay, cool. So the consensus we arrived at in London was, since there was general agreement neither one of these could be MTI for everyone, that we should split the single delivery draft into 2 different drafts, one for each kind of variant of the protocol. So that's what this is for the push side. This document was basically directly copied from the combined delivery draft and then had all of the poll parts pruned out of it. No normative changes, or there shouldn't be. If you spotted any, please yell at me and I'll fix them. And then we can work on it from there. Just to remind people what this draft or what this spec looks like. Next. So it's pretty straightforward. When a event transmitter wants to send a set to an event receiver, they make an HTTP post to the receiver's events endpoint with the set in the request body. Next. Success response is simple and obvious. 202 accepted. We're using accepted because we're not actually processing the set necessarily. We're just recording it to be processed asynchronously out of band. This is basically just informing the transmitter that this set has been received and the receiver is taking responsibility for handling it from there. Next. Error responses are just 400s with an error object in the response. We talked about this a little bit in London. There was a question around whether we wanted to use HTTP status codes. The consensus was let's just do 400 and leave it at that. Next. So where we're at, I published the kind of initial cut of this push-only draft in April. It needs to be edited and pared down so it's not just a heavy copy from the original draft. As far as implementations go, Google has a transmitter up and running. They're working on a receiver, I believe. Is there anyone from Google who can confirm that? Maybe not.
Maybe on the Jabber.
Yeah. Amazon is working on receiver and transmitter, and we're working with Google to get those interoperable. So I think that's the last slide. All right, so that's it, short and sweet.
Mike Bishop, if I can make a quick observation as somebody who deals with HTTP and is not very familiar with this draft, when you started talking about HTTP push, this is not what I expected. That's kind of an overloaded term, so we might want to be maybe even find a different word for this.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, what were you thinking of when you heard HTTP push?
HTTP2 push promise frames.
Okay.
Server push.
Okay.
Associated with a request coming down from the server.
Okay, that's fair. So maybe think about different names for this. Point taken. Anybody else have any other questions or observations? Has anybody actually read these drafts? Yay, we got a couple. Awesome. Cool.
I read the old one. Does that count?
Yes. Cool. All right. I will hand it off to Mike then to talk about poll.
Yeah, Annabelle, by the way, I posted comments on the current version
Yes.
of the draft, so eventually please process them.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Clicker might work on this one.
It might.
Yes, working clicker.
Because he had a PDF.
I think that makes it less likely to work. Mike Jones, Microsoft. I'll be talking about the other transport draft, the poll-based draft. And as I said on the list, I'll give you the caveat. I had not read the predecessor draft in quite some time. And so for good or for bad, what you're seeing on my slides to come and what you already saw on the list, if you were reading it, was my reactions to what the state of the poll draft is. And some of the comments, as I'll say as we go through, apply to both because there's a lot of text shared between both. It did work. What do you know? So what is this? It is, it defines a polling-based delivery mechanism for sets. As Annabelle said, both of these drafts are essentially just a copy of the draft that used to have two mechanisms in it while redacting the one that doesn't apply. So I have a number of different issues with the poll spec. And my point is for us to have discussions about each of these and possibly have proposed resolutions for us to take to the list and for the editors to apply as we go forward. The first is there's a terminology mismatch that the delivery draft was not apparently updated to match the terminology that the now approved set spec eventually used. So I and the other editors need to just sort that out. There may be cases where you do want the term transmitter to and recipient to remain, but at least event recipient and set recipient are just clearly meant to be the same thing. Transmitter is not, but we need to work this through. I'm not proposing that we do anything with that here unless somebody wants to rush to the microphone. I found that the description of the JSON data structure was not clear enough to know what it actually was without reading the examples. That just needs to be fixed. The first normative thing that bothered me about the poll draft is that there's duplication of information, which is nearly always a bad thing in a protocol. It puts the JOT ID both in a object member tag and in the value of the object by copying it out of the set and putting it in a second place. I think we should drop the second value and just send the set. I will note that that would make it more parallel with the other transmission spec, which is just sending the set and is not duplicating that value.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Just to provide context for the design as it currently is, I believe the rationale for that, and I'm acting as a secondhand messenger here, was that by putting the JTI in as a key in the JSON object, it would allow a processor of that to filter out and skip sets that it had already processed just based on JTI. We can argue whether or not that kind of efficiency optimization is worth it. I'm not 100% convinced it is myself, but I believe that was the rationale for that decision.
Well,
So
go ahead,
Tony
Tony.
Hadlin, yes, we use that today. So we do filtering based upon that today in our push.
But we could do filtering based on,
I'm just telling you what
The
we're
claim.
doing. I'm telling you what we're doing today.
okay.
Tony's got his grumpy voice on.
One of the generic problems with doing this sort of thing is you introduce error cases that otherwise could not occur. You all of a sudden have to check that the JTI in one place is the same as the JTI in the other. And so in fact, you can't just ever use the first JTI, you still have to check. So I would propose that we delete the first one.
Channeling fill, is this on? Channeling fill, the JTI was being used to acknowledge the sets received since sets are identified by the JTI.
This is not a set received, this is a set transmitted.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. So in order to acknowledge the set is received, I think you at least need to make sure that you can parse the set. So you'd still need to kind of crack it open and do your signature validation and all of that anyway. So if that's the use case, I don't really think it applies.
Yeah, I agree. You have to crack and parse the set. So you have to pull the JTI. You have to be able to pull the JTI out. So you might as well use it. I'd actually ask the chairs to take a hum on this. Should we simplify it or leave it as is? Word it as you wish, but I'd like to get closure on this so that we can move the draft forward.
Given that we have a very small number of people here and that some of the key players are not in the room, I would prefer to take it to the list. And if this damn thing is not working,
Yeah, it is.
it is.
Dave Kemp, NSA. I'd just like to support the speaker. I believe that you introduce problems when you duplicate information, and it's trivial to generate an index if you're already parsing the data.
Annabelle Beckman, Amazon. Given that the hums are going to be taken to the list anyway, as generally is convention, is there a need for us to delay decision until that point, or can we at least get a sense of where we are at? You know, those of us who are actually here in the room, where we're at with this.
I'm fine having a show of hands. So, two options. First option, we remove the duplication and leave it with one GTI. Second option, we leave the draft as is. Who's in favor of eliminating one of the JDIs?
Show of hands.
So that's what, 8 or so. Who's in favor
Is
of?
there any votes on Java?
So from the Jabber, Phil says that he disagrees and this is fundamentally changing the protocol.
It is an intentional change to the protocol.
Yeah, so.
And take the other vote.
Yeah, we're counting Phil for the second one. So who's in favor of leaving the protocol as is with double GTIs? Tony, anybody else?
Yeah.
And Phil.
It's a draft.
Did you want to say something at the mic, Tony?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next. I found a place where the semantics of the operators are not parallel. Max events sometimes, but not always, defines return immediately to be ignored. And I think that's an unnecessary provision in the draft. Return immediately in max events can and should be orthogonal.
Annabelle Beckman, Amazon. Again, to provide context for this, especially for people who may not be as familiar with it, the scenario we're talking about here is when max events is 0, a return immediately of false doesn't really have meaning. Like, they're just going to keep the connection open forever. Like, it's kind of a nonsensical, undefined scenario, which maybe suggests that we should be rethinking how these parameters work in general, or how they're defined in general, so we're not creating opportunities for undefined scenarios.
I agree that there shouldn't be undefined scenarios. Rather than saying it should be ignored, I think the draft should explicitly say that when these two things are true, this is the behavior. I don't think it probably changes the behavior, but describing it that way is not good spec writing.
So your concern is more about how the outcome is being expressed rather than.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're not actually ignoring it.
Yep.
You're doing a defined action. It should say what that action is, not say to ignore the parameter.
That's fair. I'd agree with that.
Can we have Phil next?
Yeah, I think.
These aren't Mutachio.
Excellent.
You have to push the button.
Press the button.
What, the big red
Yeah.
button?
The big square red button.
Do you have to hold the big red button down or?
It's just one. You should be able to.
Phil, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Press this one.
I did.
And I'm told that there should be I'm told there should be an indicator in your browser window. If your browser is picking up audio, there should be like the signal, like a level indicator as you're talking and not talking.
Still no good.
It says I'll do it by text.
Okay.
Okay, sorry.
You could impersonate him backwards.
Should I go to the next slide?
Well, let's get here.
Yeah.
He's typing his text.
So Phil says these two parameters are flags for different things.
Right, hence they should be orthogonal. And I can propose text as an editor and we can review it. I don't know that it's worth meeting time anymore.
So return immediately is used for HTTP long polling. And he's agreed that this text is still in flux.
Anyone else? Okay, and there's a big architectural thing in this draft that I readily admit I don't understand why it's there. It says that sets may be reissued. It doesn't define any conditions in which they should or must be reissued. So I think as currently written, a legal implementation could never reissue them. Other implementations might reissue them. This seems like a source of interoperability problems. I think we should either say under what conditions they're to be reissued or drop the whole reissuing notion entirely. Does anybody in the room have context on that?
Annabelle Beckman, Amazon. So the context here is poll confirmation of reception of a set is asynchronous with poll. The recipient is going to be making this HTTP request to effectively download sets from the transmitter, and in a subsequent request at some point in the future, they are going to acknowledge receipt of those sets. Because of that, the transmitter doesn't really have like a deterministic way of knowing whether or not a set has been received successfully. And so they have to have some mechanism by which they'll decide, I sent this set, but I don't think it was actually received, so I'm going to kind of flag it as available to be resent again.
Is that out of band? Someone sent them email saying we lost 5 minutes?
There's nothing along those lines in the spec that, theoretically, I think given the way it's written, that could be a compliant implementation. The spec does define a mechanism by which a recipient can say, yes, I successfully received this set, or no, I did not successfully receive this set. I got this error in processing that one.
So is what you're saying that the language which talks about reissuing actually just talking about leaving it available for retrieval?
Right. It's about, there's sort of a state management problem here that the transmitter has to deal with, where they have this queue of sets, some of which have been downloaded by the recipient, but haven't yet been acknowledged. and they kind of have to sit in this state of flux. And at some point, those either transition to acknowledged or available to be resent.
Okay, and we could explicitly
Yeah,
say
yeah.
that. Reissued is a terribly confusing term.
Yeah, I think the spec would benefit from a section that just goes into firm detail about this state management on the transmitter side and what the transitions are for sets there.
Note taker, can you record that a state management section would probably be helpful and would remove this current ambiguity?
Yeah, I think Phil is basically agreeing, it's a multi-step process. The following post acknowledges the received events, but it may await the next group of sets.
Okay, thank you. It's to be considered by the editors. I'll probably work on it, but with the other editors.
So you're volunteering to do that, Mike?
With the other editors, yes.
Note taker would note that.
The spec says that there should be a mechanism for loss notification, but doesn't define one. That seems like incomplete specification of required functionality. Does anybody have context on why the draft currently says that? So the editors intended to eventually at the worst state, some of the normative stuff is even duplicated. For example, the error values should really be in one place and referenced from a common place. So I believe that the current spec organization is untenable. And it's not only untenable for the editors, it's also worse, untenable for implementers, because if you're doing both, you'll have to do a very detailed read side by side to try to figure out where are there differences and where do these differences affect my implementations. So I think this is my last slide that, or no, there's maybe one more. We could move to 3 specs, which has all the common text in one and referenced from the 2. So an example of that pattern is the OAuth assertion framework spec, RFC 7521, which is referenced from the SAML one, 7522, and the JOT one, 7523.
Mike, just to interject. Just going back to the other question, I just want to see if there's anybody that disagrees with your previous slide. Is there anybody that thinks that we should have duplicate text?
Justin Richer, as somebody thinking this from an implementing engineer's standpoint, I don't care if another document also has the same text from the document that I care about. I want to be able to go to a place and read everything. I get it from an editor's perspective. I get it from a don't repeat yourself and information cleanliness perspective. I get and agree with all of those points. But I think we can't throw out the mindset of somebody just sitting down trying to build the blasted thing is going to want to be able to read a thing, and most importantly, let's face it, implement the examples in one document and try to get everything that they need in there without surprises. Having implemented Jose, having implemented the assertions framework, having stuff, I'm agreeing with the point that I think Mike is about to make. Having to reference out to the abstracted pieces is awful. Implementing JWK is just bonkers because all of the actual content for JWK is in JWA for completely idiotic historical reasons. And so I would hope that we don't do that here. Don't do the abstraction for abstraction's sake.
Don't do the 3-doc solution.
Right. But with that in mind, I'm actually fine with 2 documents that have a lot of the same stuff in them, because if you're going to be looking at one, that's the one that you care about, and it should be self-contained.
The problem is if you're looking at 2, then you have to do the detailed side-by-side diff.
Why?
To know what is different in the 2 parts that you're implementing, probably in one framework.
And
I don't think
that
so.
Will be erroneous.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. I generally agree that having duplicate text is something we want to avoid. That said, I think there are situations, for example, references out to, in security considerations, to tell people to refer to this, the BCP on how to do OAuth securely. If you're going to use bearer tokens with this as an authentication mechanism, like that, I think is text that you're going to see duplicated across a wide variety of drafts just because they happen to be dealing with bearer tokens. I don't think we need to worry about that kind of text being duplicated. I think normative things like the error definitions, that's definitely something that we should consolidate. I think a lot of the other text in the current drafts as they stand right now, at least from the perspective of push, is stuff that should be culled from the document. I posted some analysis of this on the list. I'm not going to repeat it here, but I'll let people review that. I think it would help us make the right decision here if, and I'll take this as an action item, if I publish an 01 draft, at least of push, that pulls out the text I'm suggesting we pull out. And at that point, then we can see what really is duplicated between the two as far as real meaningful normative text is concerned. And that might tell us, is there enough here to pull it out to where a third document is really justifiable, or do we keep it in push and reference it from poll, or vice versa? Or do we just recombine them? We'll see.
Tony Nedlin. So I would be in favor of just keeping it the way they are, duplicating the text. It's much easier to understand as far as reading and implementing these specs.
Ben Kaduk, personally channeling Phil, personally on my own, if we have stuff that's actually the authoritative creating a registry or the error codes or whatnot, that can only be in the first document that's published, and it cannot be duplicated in the other document.
That's what I thought.
Okay. And so potentially you could keep it in both documents until you know which one is going to publish first, and even as RFC editor notes, say drop these sections from the second document. And let's see, Phil has some more. From Annabelle's presentation, the use of HTTP status is to follow normal HTTP. The use of error codes is due to message processing, like, is the JWT valid? I guess that's just, the difference between using HTTP status codes versus our error codes.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide. There's some possibilities there, and there's more that have been discussed in person since that. Some possible choices are go to 3 specs. I don't think anybody is in love with that, but I wanted to try to be comprehensive. Move to 1 spec and have the conformance requirements be as discussed on the list, that you can conform by doing either A or B. And there's plenty of RFCs that do that. I mean, OAuth is a classic one that you can implement either the code flow or the implicit flow, or you can do both. And this would be exactly like that. So it's not like we would be breaking new ground and doing something unprecedented. I think editorially and in terms of understanding it for implementers, that's the cleanest thing to do. There's a third alternative which isn't on the slides, which at least Dick and I and Annabelle talked about in the hallway, which is we could do like we did between JWS and JWE. There's a bunch of normative stuff in JWS, like the definition of base 64 URL, that when referenced or when used in JWE, it just says, do it like you did in JWS. For instance, we could do a push spec, which is complete, and a poll spec, which every time something is the same, you have a section that says, this is the same as that section in this other doc. And then at least you're out of the duplication world, and it's still easy to read.
Yeah, so a priori, my preference would be to go back to 1 single spec. However, we have one solution that is much further ahead of the other one. And so my preference today would be to go forward with a push spec that contains the whole thing, and have the poll spec minus the duplicated text and referencing sections in the push spec.
And
I realize that people that are in favor of the push spec might not like it because it seems like it's sort of dependent, but it will not require, and we should make it clear in both specs, that you do not have to implement poll in order to implement push, but we still get rid of the textual duplication and avoid all the traps of divergence by mistake.
As an editor, I would be okay with that.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. So 2 points. One, I think that if SET is broadly successful, it's inevitable that we will have other distribution specs over time. And most of, or at least a lot of what is normative and duplicated between these two, that's shared between push and pull, I think a lot of that is stuff that will be broadly useful to other distribution methods as well. For example, the error codes, that's a good example of something that really applies generally to anyone who's processing a JOT or a set and wants to signal something's wrong with this. Those are useful. Mike, you look like you want to say something in response to that.
No, I agree with you.
Oh, okay, I'll take that. The other point I wanted to make is that 6749 has been cited as an example where this sort of either or method of spec writing has been employed and has been successful. I question that as somebody who's worked with a lot of clients who've been trying to implement OAuth 2. I think the collection of different mechanisms in that document leads to a lot of implementation confusion. And having a spec that says, this is what you do, everything in here is, this is MTI, just do this, without any additional or alternative content that you have to filter out, makes for a cleaner document and makes for an easier implementer process.
I agree, although I'll note that in practice, having two delivery specs or having two delivery mechanisms, no matter how they're factored editorially, still means that implementers will have to make choices about, do I build one, do I build the other, do I build both, just like they have to make those choices in OAuth. So we're not removing that need to understand your problem space in order to decide what to build.
If I could clarify for Annabelle, having worked with people doing OAuth, many people look at OAuth and assume they need to implement everything as opposed to just the things they need for their implementation.
Right. It changes from the question of, okay, what are my requirements versus what does this spec require me to implement? And those are kind of two different questions. And I think putting multiple options in one spec muddies the waters there. And
I don't disagree. I mean, I agree with Dick's point that some people have no idea what to implement when they're looking at OAuth, so they implement the kitchen sink.
Ben Kaduk, so with respect to error codes in particular, it is absolutely the common thing to do to say, the first document in a given space defines the initial set of error codes, creates the registry, and then everything else that follows refers to the registry as their source of error.
Correct.
Codes. You're not referring to the document, you refer to the registry. Yeah. Phil Hunt. So, since only a couple of implementations exist, you could also consider a new proposal like SSTP, which is similar to both and unifies the method. There's only one implementation of a push transmitter, and I disagree with Annabelle. The whole point of forming SECEVENT was to develop a universal delivery method, so we don't expect to have new delivery methods popping up willy-nilly.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. I think SSTP is actually worse than both of the existing proposals in that it creates something that is more complicated for everybody by trying to unify things. So I think that would make life worse for implementers all around. As far as having one unified distribution method, I think that's an unrealistic expectation to put have put in the charter for the working group. I think it's kind of absurd to think we're going to have one distribution method when there are multiple protocols out there that people might be using this over. I mean, all you have to do is imagine an IoT use case, and now you're talking, you're not talking HTTP anymore, and all of this is out of the question.
Phil Hunt, this feels like a NIMBYism, talking about the requirements.
So I think it'd be useful just to drive clarity on that one point as to whether there's an appetite for changing from what we have now with multiple delivery to single delivery, and maybe get a show of hands. The two options would be continue on our current path where we have a push and pull, and the other option would be to a single delivery that Phil's proposing. So a show of hands on to continue with the current path. There's an independent mechanisms. Show of hands of who's interested in single mechanism. And on Jabber, I'm assuming Phil voted for that. Yeah.
Phil also says that it doesn't. The group could just simply solicit new proposal. It doesn't have to take SSTP as is. It could be something else.
So as an editor, I would request that we at least get to a solution to the duplicated text problem that we can all live with. Wait, I want the chairs to actually listen if we're going to do this.
Well, I just wanted to also figure out what we thought the results of that was. So.
Okay, I'll do that first and then I'll wait.
Yeah, so the result, as far as the room, is clearly in favor of staying with multiple delivery mechanisms, but this also needs to go to the list.
Okay, then in terms of closing out this discussion so the editors can edit, it seems to me, but I'm asking people if you agree with me, like the thing Yaron proposed at the microphone is probably the most expedient thing, that being leave the push spec where everything exists and reference the pieces that are common from the poll spec. Would that be okay with people, or is anybody going to say that's a terrible thing? I mean, duplicating text is just untenable.
So Ben Kayak is responsible AD. I have to apologize for not having read both of these drafts in detail, but I think it would be easier to make a decision on this question if we had a sense of what types of things are actually duplicated. I mean, we know that the error codes are duplicated. I assume there's other stuff.
6 of 7 sections are
right,
entirely
what was the
duplicated.
logical content of those? Okay.
All the background, the introduction, the description of why you would deliver events, what events are, terminology, it's all duplicated. The only thing that's not duplicated is the actual delivery mechanisms. The security considerations are entirely duplicated. The implementation guidance is entirely duplicated. The references are entirely duplicated. The abstract is nearly duplicated. But not perfectly, and that's what drives me nuts as an editor. And it'll only get worse if we try to keep with the current structure.
Justin Richer, I am actually fine with that approach as an ultimate goal, but again, I encourage the editors to keep an engineer's hat on for at least part of this.
Which approach?
Oh, sorry, with the approach that Mike has suggested of keeping most of the content in the push spec and have it referenced from the poll spec. But I encourage the editors to keep an implementing engineer's hat on, someone who doesn't want to click open another browser tab to read a different document because it's a nightmare to cross-reference RFCs.
Absolutely. And
Right.
certainly
So
all the mechanisms and the examples are still
exactly.
fully specified.
Exactly.
It's the background information
Yep.
that is not going to be duplicated everywhere.
Right. So summarize with reference for detail is fine.
Yeah.
I would encourage to err on the side of loquacity in what you might consider the duplicated text, but otherwise, in general, the approach is good.
Thank you.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Yeah, I'm completely on board with moving forward with keeping everything, so to speak, in push and referencing that from poll. If somehow the advancement of these documents flips and poll ends up moving forward faster, I'd be happy with the inverse of that as well. I do think that once we do the editorial pass on push, a lot of what is duplicated right now is, are things that just don't need to be there. Like if you look at the definition section, for example, that should be a one-line section that says we use things defined in set. Everything, all of the definitions listed there are things already defined in set, except for numeric date, which push does not actually use. So
right, where there you should reference JOT.
Sure. Yeah. Well, then that's what poll should do that, since poll uses it.
Right.
And there's similar things in the security considerations. There's a bunch of sort of shoulds and maybes, and when we should just be pointing people at relevant
Right.
BCPs.
I think we agree. Why don't
Yeah.
you and I just work together and make it happen?
I think that sounds great. And I'll, like I said, I'll take an action item note taker. You can quote me on this to put together a cleaned up version of O.1 for push, and Mike, you and I can go over that.
Good.
So
Thank
I'd
you.
like to hear if there's anybody in the room or remotely who has a strong dislike to this proposal of having everything fully specified in push and referenced from the poll document. Can you speak at the mic?
You would be making work, Tony.
No, I'm not, Mike. I think you're making work because the specs are there today. They may evolve they're separate documents today. Okay. If you want to have the common text, you need to combine them into a single document so the people that are implementing don't have to jump back and forth between these two specs. They can read one spec. Some people are only going to implement push. Some people are only going to implement pull, and then they have to read the other document, and they're going to get confused. I mean, this is ridiculous. And so, there's probably be no synchronization other than the first time through on these documents is to get the text copied, which it already is. The common text is already copied.
Ben Kadek, Tony, I think you're absolutely wrong that there's going to be no synchronization. As AD, I will insist that there's synchronization when the second one comes up.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Tony, can you just clarify, would you object to poll referencing push as far as the error codes are concerned? Pointing at the same IANA registry that might be defined in push, for example?
I'm okay with the error codes and stuff because it's just going to point to the IANA registry thing. That's fine.
I honestly think at the end of the day, that's about the only normative content that's duplicated between these two protocols. So I think when we get the O.1, a lot of your concerns will be alleviated. So I ask that you keep an open mind until then.
What I was going to say in response to your comment, Tony, is all the normative stuff for both documents stays in their own document and all the examples. So that's what the implementers are mostly reading. If they want to read background material, yeah, they may have two browser tabs open. Okay, thank you all. I
Yes, I think we have a way forward here. Please go ahead with
Thanks.
Tutorial.
All right, thank you.
Tutorializing.
Dick, are you going to be my clicker again?
I will be your clicker.
Front row seats, you're stuck. Okay, Annabelle Beckman, Amazon again, to talk about subject identifiers for security event tokens. Next. So, apologies for the confusion here. This was something that originally started in a ID and sec events that didn't get adopted, so we pulled it into risk. And then in London, we talked about, hey, could we pull this out on its own and just cover subject identifiers within set? People were interested in that. I submitted it as an ID and then went back and realized, hey, we actually approved it as a working group document. So it has been resubmitted as a working group doc. Click the, use the bottom link there. That's the one we want. Next. Yes. So just to refresh people's minds about what we are talking about here, JOT has the subclaim, works for a lot of situations. It doesn't work for every situation as far as identifying the subject of the token or of the set. We ran into this in risk where we have use cases for supporting a variety of different ways of identifying a subject. It could be email, could be phone number. There's new ones that we're coming up with over time. And it is helpful to provide a unambiguous way to state what kind of, or how you are identifying the subject. So we're not trying to parse the format of strings to determine, is this a phone number? Is this an email? That's not a place we want to be in. The other part, it's a subset of that problem is if you have complex identifiers that are multi-part, for example, issuer and subject, that's two claims, right? It's not one claim. If you have a scenario where the issuer for your subject identifier is different from the issuer for your set, then you need some way to put that subject issuer with that subject claim together, and you can't really do that if all you have is a single string field. So, are you done? Okay. So, just as an example for some context, what this looks like in risk, we have this subject claim within our event payload, and this shows up in all of the risk events. And that's where we put any claims that we use to identify the subject as well as the subject type claim that I'll get to in a moment. So next. So what do we actually have in this draft? We start with defining subject identifier types, which is just basically a schema for what claims you use to identify a subject using some type of data, using an email, using a phone. What claim do you use for that? What format do you put the data in? Everything you find in the schema, as well as names for these schemas and an IANA registry to track those. Next. And then as far as how we use those, we define a subject identifier, which is just a JSON object that has a subject type whose value is a name of a subject identifier type, and the rest of the JSON object is to be interpreted as claims according to the schema for that subject identifier type. And let's go through some examples. We got like 4 different examples here. Email is pretty simple and obvious. There's an email claim. The type name is email. Phone, similar. Next. Issuer and subject is where we get a little bit more interesting because we have 2 different claims here, but it's still the same concept. Next. ID token claims is the most interesting one, type that's defined in the core spec. We have use cases where the claims used to identify a subject could be varied, but they came out of an ID token. So depending on what the client asked for in the ID token, they might have issuer subject. Well, they're going to have issuer subject. They might also have email. They might also have phone. And the OP does not necessarily know which of those the client is using in their system to tie their local account to the account at the OP. Ideally, they're using issuer and subject, but a lot of people, it turns out, in practice don't do that. So it's helpful for the OP to always specify in a set all of the potentially identifying claims that they sent in an ID token. So if you look at the schema for this one, it's issuer and subject, or email, or phone number, or some combination of those are what's defined in that. Next. So where we're at with this, haven't had a lot of comments on it, probably because people haven't read it yet, so take a look at it. Tell me what I did wrong defining this IANA registry, because it's the first time I'm doing this, so I'm sure I broke some rules somewhere there. Yes?
If you want, I don't think you, I'm not here to say you've broken the rules, but my question is, so you're presumably you're doing like expert review on this, or is it
yes.
Publication required?
It is expert review.
All right. Is there like any reason to use like a short string? Like, is this really a space constrained environment typically, so that it matters, or would it be smarter to use a URI so we didn't have to be like do a lot of review on subject types?
So the value of having a registry is also to make sure that people are not redefining different ways to do the same thing.
Do you want to respond? Sure, but there are actually quite a lot of definition of like things that look like email in the wild.
Sure.
And they're all gonna come and ask for something that looks like email at some point, which sort of is what I was thinking. Maybe this is smarter to do with the URI.
And looking like email and being email are two different things.
Right. To clarify, I meant to say things that are actually email addresses but have different semantics than the typical usage of email in the kind of deployment scenarios I think you're looking at.
Okay, well, then potentially we need to clarify what the semantics should be around a type. I don't think you want to have, if you look at two identifiers with the same type and with the same claims, they should mean the same thing. And so, if one is an email address, the other should be, the same value should be the same email address. So, if we're talking about like name spacing issues of things that look the same but are actually different, then that sounds like something that should be specified in the schema. Justin, you want to?
Yeah, Justin Richard, to partially respond to Leif. In the wild, what I think ends up happening with a lot of these, use a URI kind of thing, is that somebody defines a URN and then you have to register underneath that URN. Mm-hmm. And so you basically just punt the registry to a different registry for a little bit. Mm-hmm. We have this with the OAuth grant types. There's no OAuth grant type registry except that there is. It's just not called the OAuth grant types registry anymore. It's the OAuth URN thing because that's what you're supposed to use. And and there's stuff like this all over SAML as well. There's like so many different URN things in SAML that. So let's just register the short strings and just admit that that's what we're going to do anyway.
And Leif, I'd love to hear more about the specific examples you're thinking of as well, because I want to make sure we're covering all the bases here. But yeah, please, Leif, out of band. Let's talk about that. Oh, no, I don't think we need to take group meet time for it.
We have lots of time. Leif has other examples.
Well, let's
go through the rest of the queue.
Yeah, sorry if I'm diving into a rat hole, but these don't really look like identifiers, especially when you have a token ID, whatever that is, and email and phone number in the same so-called identifier, where you might have multiple people sharing the same phone number but different email addresses and vice versa. And so there's a lot of hidden semantics behind how do you actually match a record to whatever this thing is. There's this semantic need to be specified here. Otherwise, it's just completely opaque to the implementer.
I think there's probably room to be clearer about the semantics here. I think that's good feedback that we've heard a couple of times now. Regarding things like phone number, the phone number itself is essentially the subject here. If we look at, again, the risk use cases, it's, say, Google sending a set to Amazon where the only link, the only common piece of information we have is that we both have accounts related to phone numbers. And if on our side, there are multiple accounts related to that phone number, that's fine. The phone number is the meaningful thing that action is being taken against. And so we're going to potentially connect that to multiple accounts on our side.
So yeah, that's really a matching rule. So I would say these are not identities. These are really hints or identity hints.
I didn't say they were identities.
The use case for this is in kind of OpenID Connect, where you've sent over a claim like this. Each of these is a globally unique identifier for the user. They're all for the same user. And the recipient might have picked one of these to store as their identifier, but the sender didn't know which one, and so it needs to send all of them again so that the recipient gets the one that they may have used.
Jan, was your comment with respect specifically to this example that's up right now, or is it to the broader problem? Okay.
This one is the most egregious one.
Thank you. Yeah, to Dick's point, the use case here is where a party like Google may have issued an ID token with a variety of, some subset of these claims. Ideally, if people are doing things the quote unquote right way, as a relying party, you are storing issuer subject in your database and you're using that as your lookup key to match things to accounts. So you have this nice one-to-one relationship. In the real world, it doesn't work that way. And you have a lot of RPs who do matching based on email and phone number. And so the intent here is to, again, the assumption, as Dick said, is all of these belong to the same account at the OP, and the RP, they have to use whichever ones they chose to use. How they do that is really going to be dependent upon how they're managing their mappings. And I don't, we should probably clarify in this, the definition for this type that's the purpose here and that's the intent. Yeah, I don't think we can be too prescriptive about how that matching ends up working.
So I've got several things. So Ben Kaduk, I'm up here to tell you you're doing it wrong. Just kidding.
Okay.
No, there's one minor, it actually looks very good. The only minor thing that comes up is that you are creating a new registry, and INO generally wants to know like what page of registries it should go under. I think there is a page of set registries, but I don't remember offhand. You can definitely ask them to take a look.
Okay.
Whenever you want, they're happy to take an early look, see if it's clear. With respect to sort of the point that Yaron raised that we were talking about for a while, it seems like it's pretty reasonable to ask the document that is creating that registry entry to nail down what the semantics are.
Yeah.
Like for this ID token claims, it would say, well, potentially say, if I understand correctly, that you need to be including all of the claims that were in the ID token that you're referring to, because you don't know, which ones are being used as the database key, or whatever semantics you actually want. You should nail down what the semantics are.
John's shaking his head. I don't know if you want to add something, John.
The claims that the relying party have may come from a number of places, including the user info endpoint. So we don't want to be prescriptive that there has to be a match of an exact set. These are, again, more hints-ish, I agree, than exact subjects.
Okay, I mean, a different way of putting it might be that you should include in here the set of claims that you have shared with that RP.
Yeah, so just be clear what the actual semantics you want.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the point about semantics is well taken. I don't think there's anything in the spec that talks about including that in explicitly in the definition for a subject identifier type, and that's something we should add. So.
And Phil Hunt, it can be, or this can be used in a space constrained environment because the sets are JOTs and they may need to be passed in constricted spaces. So getting towards, do you want the long or the short identifiers? And I'm also hearing that some set scenarios are being used for attestation. So using URIs for that would really expand the size and costs of retention.
I'll let you one second. I'll take one final stab, but since Dick was foolish enough to say that we have time. To be specific, I think what I would argue for is to have like URIs as the subject type, and have a registry that has publication required under a well-defined URL scheme allocated by ANA, right? So if you're in the standard claims, right? If you want to add a standard claim, then we raise the bar, right, for entry, right? And if it's, but it was because you're using URIs, any group of collaborating entities can do what they want without risk of collision. And I think what's going to happen here in practice is that people are just going to do what they want, right? It's JSON, right? The expectation is that you stick like attributes in there and have at it, right? And so I don't think nobody's ever going to bring a registration other than the ones we defined in this document, right? People are just I'm going to define an EPPN subject type, right? And that's the edu-person principal name, right? Has semantic, but these things are going to leak, right? Somehow, right? They're going to, because we don't have like hermetically sealed off compartments in the world, right? Yeah. So I think that's the reason is to avoid those kinds of collisions. That would be my argument for using URI, and that's it. I won't argue anymore.
Can we quote you on that?
Cool. Justin Richard, this is why life is full of it. No, I mean, he's absolutely right in that these things will just get defined and used and leaked, but that's because the IETF has no enforcement arm. As much as we like to pretend that our RFCs are law, they're not. People will ignore them. And yeah, because URLs never have weird collisions or fun things like that. And yeah, have you ever tried to use LOA URLs across system boundaries, dude? Seriously. Well, as soon as VOT is published, yes, I agree with you, but Ben pushed a button. We're on our way. But no, seriously, URLs don't magically fix that. URIs don't magically fix that leakage problem anyway. And so I go back to saying that so the short claim names with, as Ben brought up, very clear semantics as to what this object actually means is probably our best stab at having well-meaning implementers do the right thing a lot of the time.
Brian Campbell, just one, I don't know if this helps or muddies the water, but one potential kind of solution to all this is that the subject type value could be, as you have it now, a short name with a registry, and then have some text in there that allows it to be also be a URI. And in that case, it doesn't need to be registered.
Analogous to what's in JOT for public versus That was something I was actually going to pose to the group. So thank you for raising that. I think that may be a good compromise.
That was a good idea.
Thank you.
Ben Kadek, so specifically in the registration guidelines, you have to exclude things that are in the form of the URI or URN or whatever you want to use.
Right. Good point. Leaf gave a thumbs up. Let the record show. 2 thumbs up. All right.
Brian again, while I'm here and there's no line, can I comment on the color of the bike shed real quick? Well,
of course.
I know these are, at least in the set world, their size is maybe not a huge thing, but like I see something like subject and then subject type under that. I'm wondering if like the type, it couldn't just be type or underscore type or something that's not as redundant and maybe just a little bit shorter for cases where these might end up in more space constrained needs. Just a little redundancy, less redundancy might be helpful.
I think there's an argument there too, is regarding one of the open questions I have. If you want to jump back to the last of the slide at the end, I think. Yeah, that in risk, we're starting to see use cases where, strictly speaking, we're using this to represent something that is not the subject of the set. I have an example, I think, if you go one slide forward. So in risk, we're starting to define a set of OAuth related event types, one of these being token revoked, where we think it's useful to indicate not just the subject of the set, but also the subject of the token, where the subject of the set is the token itself. But then depending on what the RP is doing with that, they may want to know quickly and easily what user did this token actually apply to. So having the token subject there is useful as well. From that, it's easy to imagine where this might apply to things that aren't subjects. They might be kind of, if we think grammatically, direct objects. And then at that point, calling it subject type, subject identifier may not make sense. And yeah.
That's fair. Just a thought. And then maybe I'm somewhat opposed to where you were just going with that, but in terms of general subject identification, and I apologize, I haven't read it yet, but I could see this being useful outside of the context of set. Is it by chance written in a way that it could be referenceable?
Yeah, I think it makes mention of sets. It also makes mention of JOTs in general.
Okay.
I don't think there are any hard dependencies on set or anything that would preclude you from using it in other contexts.
Okay.
But that's something to look at, and I would not be opposed to removing those constraints if they are there.
Cool, thank you. I can think of one use case already where it might be useful.
Good.
Thanks.
Thank
Do
you.
you want to share that?
Sure.
You can say no.
No, I can. In the Moderna working group of the OpenID Foundation, they have what they're calling CIBA, client initiated back channel authentication, which has its own. There's a world of hurt there, but one of the things is it's basically a back channel invocation from a client to an authorization server asking for user authorization around something. But it's all out of band. The user authorization's out of band. So the subject, the user has to be identified some way or hinted to in that request. And there's a few different ways that you can kind of do it. But one is a structured token where the client can say, hey, here's what I know about this person. And being able to say what the type of subject is and identify the type inside of that, much like this, I think would be a useful way to not constrain, but just narrow down how the input to that works.
Is what you're describing similar to the login hint in OpenID Connect?
Ish. Yes.
Where that's just a string value in OpenID Connect, but
Right.
Potentially could have benefited from something like
From
this.
something a little more structured that says what the context of the string is. Yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
Cool.
Exactly.
Excellent. Thank you.
Dave Kemp, NSA. This may be a color of the bike shade comment too, but it looks, if these are examples, but you've mentioned schema before, it looks a little unusual to have a type structured the way it is. In other words, in this example, your subject is an OAuth token. The value of an OAuth token has 3 fields in it, a token type, identifier token. It might be something to consider to have just your OAuth token be the value of subject and the value of OAuth token be those 3 fields underneath it. So just something to consider. It seems a little more natural from a schema perspective to define the contents of an OAuth token.
I'm not sure I completely follow the structure you're saying, but
so in this example, you would have subject and it would have one property. That property would be OAuth token.
Okay.
The value of OAuth token would be token type, token identifier.
I see. So the subject type would be the key.
Yes.
In an object with a single property that, and then its value would be another object. The downside I see with that is somebody parsing it, you don't know what property to look for. You enumerate the properties, so is it really that big of a deal? Maybe not. But I think from the standpoint of a implementer reasoning about the format, seeing, okay, I get subject type and I look at that and then, I case on the statement on that and figure out what I need to read from there. I think that leads to a clearer path to implementation, but that may be preference.
Phil Hunt, regarding OAuth token revoke, I find it very confusing when I read it, and I would prefer the OAuth working group define the token revoke event.
Okay, Phil, I asked that you raise that in the risk working group, as this is an example I pulled from there, and they're the ones that need to be told not to do it.
Your Honor, everybody likes JSON objects, but I'm wondering if we shouldn't have multi-valued things here, like if I have 2 phone numbers or 2 email addresses for my subject, and I want to specify that, rather than having multiple of these in my set or whatever.
So you're talking about specifically having multiple values for one of the claims within a subject identifier, not having multiple subject identifiers. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. We talked about the latter some, and it might apply here as an alternate way to get what you're looking for. We talked about whether or not we needed in risk subject itself to be an array, and the decision we made there was subject itself can be a single value, or an object, and as that's going to be the majority case, and then if there are other subjects or other subject identifiers that the sender needs to include in that, then the event could define a subject aliases or an aliases value in its, an aliases property in its event payload, and that could be a list. That way you're only putting the list processing work on the handful of cases that might actually care about it. That would be one way to address what you're talking about as well, but if multiple phone numbers is actually a really common case, and I could see where that would start to be cumbersome.
Justin Richer, I agree that I agree with Annabelle that having the processing for the multiple case be paid by the default is going to probably be problematic. I know you didn't go quite as far to say that, but that's what you meant. But no, seriously, this whole question of single value versus multiple value is going to keep coming up. And I think this actually relates to the comment on the syntax from a minute ago. And one of the things that I regret about the set format, and I've been very public about this in this group, is proposing the format, which is now in the RFC, because that can potentially lead to cases where people have multiple unrelated things in a single object. And that would be the downside to that key style syntax, is that I could give you a subject object with subjects that are different objects within the subject object that are referencing different subjects.
That was similarly one of my concerns about just making subject itself an array.
Right.
Is that would lead to
Very similar.
likely people putting identifiers for subjects that are really have different relationships to the event, and that's where we ended up with subject versus token subject as explicitly stating this is the relationship that this the thing identified by the subject identifier has with this set.
Right.
And I think being explicit about that is really good.
I agree, and I also believe that the having aliases or whatever be a separate member at the same level as subject is likewise explicit. Is that here's the subject that we say is primary. It could be an arbitrary choice from a set of multiples, whatever. And here's a bunch of other things that we say are the same as that one. That can be defined as very, very clear semantics without the syntax getting in the way of simple processing.
I wonder if there's any kind of implementation experience we could draw from OpenID Connect and the audience claim, well, and JOT in general, and the audience claim being either a string or an array of strings. I think we're kind of talking about that that's trying to solve the same problem that's trying to solve. I wonder if there's history we can learn from there.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. I was actually going to talk about that very thing. We have experience that with the audience field that it's typically single valued, but there are use cases where it can be multi-valued. And so JOT defined the audience claim, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, as being either a single string or an array of strings. And there's nothing preventing us from doing that for some of these fields that might be multi-valued.
In practice, how has that worked out? My concern about doing it here with a lot of potentially any claim is that you end up with implementations that are only built to handle the single value case because that's the only thing they encounter 99.99% of the time, and then blow up at some point in the future when they hit the multi-value case. I don't know if that's come up with JOTs. I don't know if the distribution pattern is more equal there.
Justin Richer, I can't speak to the distribution pattern beyond my own anecdotal experience, but as somebody who argued for the multi-typed audience in OpenID Connect, because you do see that type of thing in other JSON and JavaScript style processing a lot. You get the thing and then figure out what it is before you process the next bit. It's kind of made writing libraries a bit of a pain because ultimately you have to store something. There are most libraries that I'm personally familiar with just store it as a multiple object under the hood. And so if you reserialize it, some libraries will just always give you an array with a single value, which is exactly what we were trying to avoid happening. I think that in my experience, you tend to not see the whole look for the single value or blow up case. People do seem to get that right, but that's usually amounts to there being kind of like a big if block that says, if is array, then do this, else do this other related, but not quite exactly the same thing. So from the expression standpoint, it's very powerful. I like it as kind of a, language and semantics mechanism. From a developer standpoint, it's a pain in the butt.
I think it's worth thinking about the next level down too.
Right.
Your processor might support it, but it's going to be surfacing that, whether it's single value or multi-value, it's going to surface that as an array structure. Mm-hmm. And the application that's consuming that API, chances are they're just, I'd worry they're just going to look at element 0 and go from there and not really think about the broader case.
Exactly. And so with that in mind, I think it's something we may want to consider for values inside the subject object. But
I think that's what we're talking about.
It
here.
is, but I am making a caution on the slippery slope of having subject itself fall under this same umbrella, which I think would be a huge mistake.
I agree with that.
Dick Hart, I echo Justin's comments on implementation, and I disagree that this is comparable to audience. An audience, you're saying here's all the people it could be an audience for, and in that your logic is to check, am I one of those people? Where here we're saying here's the entity I'm referring to, and when you have multiple of the same kind of identifier, that seems odd that there wouldn't be like an identifier. There's clearly use cases where, in say the OpenID, where the party getting it may have used one of a number of identifiers. You don't know which one they use, so you need to provide each of those ones. But those aren't necessarily multiple of here's a different phone numbers. They would have picked a phone number that they wanted to use to identify.
I think that's a very good point. One of the things Justin said earlier was, issues that came up with the structure for set, allowing multiple events to be put in the same set that may not actually be related to one another. I think that gets to the point you're just making, that with audience, there isn't an expectation that those values are related to one another or point to the same thing, whereas I think here there really would be that expectation, but it would not be enforced at all by the syntax. So that's something for us to think about. I suspect this is something, if people want to discuss this on the list, it seems like a good topic for that.
Any other comments? Good discussion. Thank you, Annabelle, for that. Mike, thank you for the poll spec. Is there any other business? If there's no other business, we'll adjourn the meeting, give everybody back a few more minutes. Thank you, everyone.
We have both blue sheets. Do we have anybody who has not signed the blue sheets?
Everyone sign the blue sheet? Yes. Thank you.
We can say anything about an interim. No. Wait, before you leave the room. Hey, people, Annabelle?
Yeah.
We are looking into having a virtual interim in the next cycle, so in 2 months.
Tony? What? I'm talking to you. No, you're not. Yeah, we are.
Yes, we are.
I'm talking to somebody else. I'm talking to you. That's a fact. Maybe you can talk again. We're thinking of having an interim meeting in a couple months. Anyone opposed to that? Virtual meeting?
Depending upon date.
To discuss what?
The 3 drafts that we have actively being worked on that haven't been as active in the last cycle that we'd like to pick up the velocity on.
This is virtual, yes.
Okay.
So late September or early October. All right. This kind of assumes that we will have the 2 deliberate drafts by then. Thank you very much.
That would be good. We can go and sing victory.
The second week of October is a fight of water, which a lot of people have comments for. The first week of October is okay.
We'll post something on the list with a thing to help find a day.
Yeah, have to see which of my holidays falls on.